Good morning, everyone. I ask that you join us in the Pledge of Allegiance as we begin our public meeting for the 17th meeting of the Public Utility Commission for calendar year 2014. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Before we get seated, I'd ask that you join us this past Monday evening. There was a special memorial service recognizing a dear friend of many of us, very tragic loss in former State Senator Mike Wall's passing. True statesman, someone who was very supportive of this Public Utility Commission, very supportive of my colleagues, and I'd ask that you join us here this morning in recognizing the great accomplishments of Senator Wall, a very soft-spoken man, but had a great heart, big heart for this organization. So please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. The first item on this morning's agenda is the approval of the minutes of the September 11th public meeting, and it's a pleasure to recognize Commissioner Whitmer as editor of the minutes. Commissioner Whitmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In light of the recent events in Florida, I feel it necessary to share some information with my fellow commissioners. I, too, currently have a fan underneath the dais, but only on my side, in order to battle this room's oppressive heat. In addition, I also have a Penn State banner hanging beneath my chair, but I can neither confirm nor deny whether my dog Annie is asleep at my feet. I realize all of these are in strict violation of the rules we agreed to prior to our meeting, but I do hope you will indulge me and be willing to continue with our proceeding. With that note, I have reviewed the minutes of September 11th and move that they be approved as submitted.
Second. Any discussion? There certainly cannot be any objections to the eloquent presentation of the minutes by Commissioner Whitmer. We have a second. All those in favor say aye. The minutes are approved as submitted, and it's a pleasure to welcome to the podium here this morning to commence with public meeting agenda items, Ms. Cheryl Walker-Davis. Good morning, Cheryl.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Commissioners.
Good morning.
Good morning.
May it please this Honorable Commission, on behalf of your various offices and bureaus, we present for your consideration and disposition the following agenda items. Commencing with matters on behalf of the Bureau of Audits, it is recommended that the Commission adopt the items commencing with the recommendation to release the audit report of the PECO Energy Company at the top of page 1 and continuing with all of the items on pages 1, 2, and 3 through and including the recommendation with regard to the Herman Oil and Gas Company, Inc. gas cost rates.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously.
On page 4 of the public meeting agenda, on behalf of the Office of Competitive Market Oversight, it is recommended that the Commission adopt the recommendation to release the final order with regard to this release every 3 years, or the solicitation every 3 years, company-wide solicitation by electric distribution companies of eligible customer lists to make available for electric generation suppliers.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously.
On behalf of the Office of Special Assistance, commencing on page 5 at the top, it is recommended that the Commission adopt the recommendation with regard to noting for the record and entering into the minutes the Commission's action in granting a petition for reconsideration subject to review of the merits involving Columbia Gas of PA.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously.
With regard to the complaint proceeding involving Teresa Brown Albert versus PPL Electric Utilities Corporation, there is the motion of Commissioner Cawley.
I'd like to recognize Commissioner Cawley for purposes of his motion. Commissioner Cawley.
Thank you, and good morning. I am not going to read the entire motion. This is a situation where a customer was held responsible not only for her own account in a building, but for the usage by 2 other people who were related to her in the building. And the issue is whether she is a, quote, customer under our regulations and hence responsible for the bills for all 3 accounts. The ALJ felt that she should be held responsible for them, but the initial decision does not answer the question of whether she actually benefited from the service, but instead it relies solely on her status as the owner of the property. And therefore, there's nothing in the record to indicate that she actually benefited from the service provided to the other two accounts. Therefore, additional facts are needed to determine whether she benefited from the service and qualified as a customer under our regulations. Therefore, I move that the matter be remanded to the Office of Administrative Law Judge for a hearing to elucidate these facts, and that the Office of Special Assistance prepare an order consistent with this motion.
Second.
Any discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to be recorded in the negative.
So noted. As we get to objections,
Jump the gun.
is here any further discussion? Noting the objection of Commissioner Whitmer, the motion passes 4-1.
In omnibus fashion, it is recommended that the Commission adopt the recommendations commencing with the recommendation in the complaint proceeding at the top of page 6, that being the proceeding involving Patricia Jackson versus Pico Energy Company, continuing with the remaining item on page 6, as well as all items appearing on pages 7, 8, 9, and 10 through and including the joint petition seeking approval of an interconnection agreement involving Verizon Pennsylvania LLC and Envoy LLC.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously.
On behalf of the Bureau of Technical Utility Services, again in omnibus fashion, we recommend the adoption of the items commencing with the recommendation in the application proceeding involving Sempra Energy Trading at the top of page 11, and continuing with all items appearing on pages 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15 through and including the recommendation in the application proceeding involving Mondra Energy, Inc. at the bottom of page 15.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously.
Should be noted at the top of page 16, the application of American Broadband, Inc. The recommendation with regard to that matter is being postponed until public meeting of December the 4th. With that having been said, it is recommended that the Commission adopt the recommendation with regard to the quarterly earnings summary report.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Any objections?
Yes, I wish to be recorded as no, as I have on our previous reports. I still think the return on equity is set too high.
So noted. The motion passes 4-1, noting Commissioner Cawley's dissent.
Turning now to matters on behalf of the Law Bureau, commencing on page 17 of the public meeting agenda, it is recommended that the Commission adopt the recommendation of the proceeding involving Cavalier Telephone Mid-Atlantic LLC and their tariff filing proposing to increase the rate for new, install, and to establish a paper bill invoice fee, noting your statement, Mr. Chairman.
So moved.
Second.
Simply like to add, I have a conflict statement that I'd like to have entered into the record for this particular case, and just noting that Norman J. Kennard did not advise me on this particular matter here this morning. Any further discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously, noting my conflict statement.
Should be noted that the proceeding involving the rulemaking, the motor carrier vehicle list, age, and mileage requirements for taxis and limousines has been postponed until public meeting of November the 13th. That's the bottom of page 17. Continuing with matters on behalf of the Law Bureau, on page 18, it is recommended that the Commission adopt the recommendations in the 3 items appearing on page 18 through and including the recommendation in the United Telephone Company of PA LLC CenturyLink proceeding involving the petition for a protective order regarding its annual 2014 Price Stability Index and Service Index filing.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously.
Continuing with Law Bureau items on page 19, it should be noted at the top, the recommendation in the proceeding involving Budget Prepay Inc.'s petition to waive the recertification requirements with regard to the eligible telecommunications carrier has been postponed until public meeting of November the 13th. With that having been said, it is recommended that the Commission adopt the remaining recommendation with regard to the PPL Electric Utilities Corporation's petition seeking as a temporary waiver of certain filing requirements.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously.
Turning now to matters presented on behalf of the Office of Administrative Law Judge, commencing on page 20, with regard to the first item there appearing in the proceeding involving the complaint of Nathaniel Hainsworth versus Philadelphia Gas Works, there is the joint motion that you have, Mr. Chairman, with Commissioner Whitmer.
I'd like to have the joint motion entered into the record here this morning with Commissioner Whitmer. Before the commission today is the initial decision addressing the complaint of Nathan Hainsworth against Philadelphia Gas Works. Mr. Hainsworth filed a formal complaint alleging that the first bill he ever received from PGW was for $4,000 and that he was unable to determine whether this amount was correct. The ALJ in this proceeding denied the complaint in part and granted the complaint in part and determined that a civil penalty of $200 was appropriate for PGW's failure to issue monthly bills after the complainant became a customer. While we agree with the ALJ's determination that PGW billing error after the complainant became a customer constituted unreasonable service, we disagree with the initial decision to the extent that it finds PGW acted reasonably in its use of what is commonly known as the user without contract mechanism. As previously noted by the Commission, when properly utilized, a user without contract mechanism allows a utility to save money by avoiding repeated trips to the service address to physically disconnect or reconnect customers, usually in rental properties in major urban centers. When using this mechanism, however, utilities must be diligent in quickly determining the correct party to bill, rather than allowing a sizable balance, in this case $4,000, to accrue over a number of years in a placeholder account. The facts of this case clearly indicate that PGW failed to determine the correct party to bill in a timely manner, and allowing a balance of over $4,000 to accrue to an unascertained user over a period of time totaling more than over a 4-year period. In July of 2007, the previous occupant of the service address contacted PGW to have the service taken out of her name. PGW did not perform a physical shutoff. Instead, PGW performed what is called a soft-off, leaving service on under the PGW placeholder account. Mr. Hainsworth testified in the proceeding that he moved into the service address in the fall of 2008. While PGW did send a Dear Occupant letter requesting that the current occupant apply for a gas service in August of 2008, it appears from the record that PGW's mailing of this letter preceded the date Mr. Hainsworth occupied the apartment. Further, it appears that the company took no further action to identify the user of this account until 2011, approximately 3 years later, when it issued its first of 6 72-hour termination notices to the customer. We would be remiss here this morning if we did not point out that the record indicates that Mr. Hainsworth knew that he was using gas and not being billed for an approximately 5-year period. So to be clear, the complainant is also responsible for the situation presented in this case. To that end, the ALJ correctly determined that Mr. Hainsworth, the party enjoying the benefit of unbilled gas service at the service address listed in this case, had an obligation to apply for service and must pay for the service that he used since February of 2009. However, we disagree with the determination that PGW acted diligently in its efforts to timely identify the parties responsible gas usage at this address. Just as it is inappropriate for PGW ratepayers to subsidize other customers, it is also clearly inappropriate for PGW to use a placeholder account to continue to provide service for more than 4 years from the date of the letter requesting the occupant apply for service in August of 2008. Now, how PGW not misused the placeholder account and more diligently sought to identify the occupant, Mr. Hainsworth is unlikely to have accrued such a high balance. This constitutes a clear violation of Section 1501 of the Public Utility Code, and it warrants raising the civil penalty to a total of $500. And therefore, this morning we move that, 1, the initial decision be modified to reflect the civil penalty in the amount of $500, and that the Office of Special Assistance prepare an order consistent with this joint motion.
Second.
Any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimous. The joint motion passes unanimously.
It is recommended that the commission adopt the two remaining recommendations on page 20, as well as the two recommendations appearing on page 21 through and including ALJ Salapa's recommended decision in the proceeding involving the complaint of Reading, Blue Mountain, and Northern Railroad Company versus the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, that concludes the presentation of regular agenda items. Turning now to the carrying agenda, it is recommended that the Commission adopt, on behalf of the Office of Special Assistance, the recommendation in the proceeding involving Columbia Gas of Pennsylvania's tariff containing a proposed pilot rider new area service with regard to extending distribution lines, noting the statements of Commissioners Cawley and Whitmer.
So moved.
Second.
Like to recognize Commissioner Whitmer for purposes of her statement. Commissioner Whitmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like my statement entered into the record as if I'd read it in its entirety. Today, we consider the recommended decision and exceptions to Columbia's filing of a tariff supplement containing a proposed pilot rider new area service, or pilot rider NAS. The pilot rider NAS, as proposed, is a 4-year pilot designed to provide an alternative payment option to customers requesting distribution line extensions in areas that currently do not have Columbia Gas distribution facilities. Under Columbia's proposal, instead of a large upfront payment to fund an extension, customers would be able to pay a surcharge per meter over a 20-year period. The monthly surcharge would be capped at $35, and customers would pay interest at the weighted cost of capital. Columbia also proposed a maximum of $1 million per year in total costs covered by the surcharge across its service territory, calculated in part by looking at the average number of customer deposits received per year for the past 5 years. Among other things, the recommended decision and order include these parameters as acceptable for the pilot. It's well known that I have been a staunch proponent of innovative programs to encourage the extension of natural gas into unserved and underserved areas of the Commonwealth. Pennsylvania sits atop one of the largest natural gas reserves in the world. The ability to economically extract Marcellus gas has made Pennsylvania the second largest producer in the country. As a result, Pennsylvania consumers, residential, and very importantly, industrial customers should have every reasonable opportunity to take advantage of this efficient and clean-burning natural resource. I'm voting to support Columbia's proposal because it represents an effort to expand natural gas service. However, I am underwhelmed, and I am of the opinion that it falls short of the goals. Specifically, upon review of Columbia's proposal, I find the total funding amounts and the payback parameters of Columbia's pilot rider NAS to be underwhelming. To that end, as pilot rider NAS is put into place, I strongly encourage the company to review these aspects of the program and, when opportunities arise, propose mid-course corrections in order to create a more expansive, dynamic, and effective program that can truly encourage the extension of natural gas throughout Columbia's service territory. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Rittner. Now I'd like to recognize Commissioner Cawley for purposes of his statement. Commissioner Cawley.
Thank you, Chairman. I also support this pilot, although I have some concerns as well. The chief concern is the notice requirements for purchasers of properties and who will be required to pay this rider for a number of years. My concern is that there is inadequate notice, at least beyond the initial purchaser, because this order does not accept the administrative law judge's recommendation that there be some notation recordable at the Recorder of Deeds office, which would alert subsequent purchasers to the fact that they are inheriting a rider potentially for a number of years. Therefore, I support this because it's a pilot, but I think that Columbia, and in fact the entire natural gas industry, who are laudably making an effort to make it easier for people to receive gas, should adopt some methodology which provides for subsequent notice in a title search that the purchaser is incurring a rider along with the property. I ask that the rest of my statement be included as if I had read it in its entirety.
Thank you, Commissioner Cawley. Any further discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously, noting the statements of Commissioner Whitmer and Commissioner Cawley.
Turning now to the three matters presented on behalf of the Law Bureau. With regard to the first matter, it is recommended that the Commission adopt the Law Bureau's recommendation in the proceeding involving Lyft, Inc. with regard to the release of certain information previously deemed as proprietary and protected from disclosure, noting the statement of Commissioner Whitmer.
So moved. Second. I'd like to recognize Commissioner Whitmer for purposes of her statement. Commissioner Whitmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like my dissenting statement to be recorded as if I had read it in its entirety. There are two petitioners before us today. The first petition is for an interim emergency order filed by Kim Lyons and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, collectively known as PPG. These petitioners seek to have access to 6 pages of currently sealed transcript containing aggregate trip data provided by Lyft in Allegheny County. The second petition is for an interlocutory review and answer to a material question seeking proprietary treatment of the aggregate trip data in question. While the majority denies PPG's petition as filed, it also answers Lyft's question in the negative, thus unsealing the record and making Lyft's aggregate trip data publicly available. While I agree that PPG's petition should be denied, I disagree with the majority's conclusion that aggregate trip data provided by Lyft in Allegheny County should be publicly disclosed. When we consider the treatment of proprietary information, we look to our regulations, which state in part, a petition for protective order to limit the disclosure of a trade secret or other confidential information on the public record will be granted only when a party demonstrates that the potential harm to the party of providing the information would be substantial, and that the harm to the party, if the information is disclosed without restriction, outweighs the public's interest in free and open access to the administrative hearing process. In this case, the sole factual information involves aggregate number of rides Lyft provided in Allegheny County during designated times. While I agree that the information at issue does not include certain nuances of the rides, I believe that publicly disclosing the aggregate number of rides given by Lyft in Allegheny County at certain time intervals is confidential and will allow Lyft's competitors to gain information that can, and I believe most likely will, be used to substantially harm Lyft and its operations in the future. Specifically, I'm persuaded by Lyft's arguments in its main brief that public disclosure of aggregate trip data of its operations in Allegheny County will allow Lyft's competitors to, among other things, assess and calculate market share in Allegheny County, model and forecast Lyft's activities in other markets, reassess resource development in Allegheny County, and serve as a building block to replicate Lyft's sales patterns in other markets. All of these factors, both individually and collectively, illustrate why Lyft has met its burden to show why the trip data at question is proprietary in nature and should be afforded confidential treatment under a protective order, as we do for other proprietary information like the number of EGS customers and other industrial customer information, even when amassed in the aggregate, that would be of value to a company's competitors and whose disclosure would substantially harm a customer. At this juncture, I believe that the Commission should err on the side of caution and properly protect this information that Lyft seeks to be treated as confidential under our regulations. The transportation network company market is a burgeoning market in Pennsylvania, as well as in other jurisdictions, and I'm not convinced that the information concerning the aggregate number of rides given by Lyft in Allegheny County will not result in substantial harm to Lyft's operations and the financial performance in the future. If the Commission chose to grant Lyft's protective order, other parties will still have access to the information in accordance with a properly executed confidentiality disclosure agreement. In doing so, both interests articulated in this case would have been balanced. For these reasons, I will be dissenting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Whitmer. Is there any further discussion on this particular matter? I feel compelled after Commissioner Whitmer's statement to just simply add that here we are in a temporary emergency approval that was granted to these two entities. And I would simply add, in the spirit of transparency, it was clearly articulated to the parties during the ALJ proceeding that this data was going to be requested. So, I mean, here we are today simply asking the parties to put forth in the aggregate the number of rides that had been operational without an approval from the Public Utility Commission. And I agree with everything Commissioner Whitmer said. I'm getting in touch with my inner CNBC here this morning. TNCs are in the marketplace. However, and this is the big however, that there are rules that need to be applied for these entities to properly operate in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And that's what we are tasked with as a Public Utility Commission. So I remember, Commissioner Cawley, it was your motion that requested this data, and it was part of the ALJ proceeding as I look out at Chief ALJ Rainey. And the parties kind of started with the Fifth Amendment plea and then moved into furnishing the data. So at the end of the day, I think it's important to note that we're simply trying to be transparent, whether it's the media or other interested parties in this case. And the market share issue, I think that story is yet to be told in terms of how it can be used against a competitor in the marketplace, realizing, and this is important to note, realizing I think there is a tremendous transportation void in the greater Pittsburgh region, and we heard that through our en banc hearing proceeding here in Hearing Room 1. So I just want to note that here this morning. And is there any further discussion? We will note the objection of Commissioner Whitmer, and the motion passes 4-1.
It is recommended that the Commission adopt the recommendations on behalf of the Law Bureau in the remaining two proceedings involving the Rasier-PA LLC application for experimental ride sharing, as well as the Lyft Inc. Application for experimental ride sharing, and the noting for the minutes and recording into the record the Commission's actions in extending the emergency temporary authority granted to these companies by notational vote.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, the motion passes. Vice Chairman Coleman, sorry.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to make a comment this morning that I am reluctantly approving these two emergency temporary authorities. And I'm mindful that when we originally approved the emergency temporary authority for the two companies, that came with various conditions. And to your point this morning, that there are rules in the state of Pennsylvania that need to be complied with. As of the notational voting, neither of these companies have complied with those conditions of that initial emergency temporary authority or the one that we're granting this morning. So my message to both companies today is that I would urge them to pay particular attention to the conditions that we have attached to these emergency temporary authorities and to comply with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Coleman. Any further discussion? Any objections? Hearing none, the motion passes unanimously. And are there any further items to come before the Commission here this morning, Cheryl?
Mr. Chairman, that concludes the presentation of public meeting reports, but I believe that there's a retirement that you want to address.
There is, and on that note, I'm going to gavel out, and we are adjourned.